Hello folks, this is Gary Geraths. This video deals with how to lay out a complete gouache painting from the pencil block in to the process of mixing and applying paint. A couple of points I must add as the demonstration gets started is that though this was done in a studio to make sure the lighting was correct, I tried to make the process and technique as close to plein air painting as possible. But more about that later. This pencil sketch has been sped up about 3 times faster so we can see how it's all designed into a decent time frame. As I scan the complexity of the composition, one thing I look at is not making things overly complicated and get involved with textures, but mainly turn everything into really simple basic shapes and boxes, especially the cars. I make the shapes a priority because then I can see how the objects all sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Also, I can see the proportions and see how one car is maybe a little bit wider than the other car, and then those tumblers in the back, those rock tumblers there, I can look at them and then compare them against the other pieces. Now, normally what I would do is I would hit the horizon line in the background, but since these are the most formidable parts of the drawing, I make this my focal point at first. Also, you might notice that I don't try to copy the photograph. I've moved things around. One of the cars is a little bit wider than the other. I've moved the rock tumbler around. You'll notice later in the drawing, I'm going to get rid of the equipment in the background and heighten the mountains out. But what I am doing right now is, again, I'm looking for shape. I'm looking for corners. The reason for that is that if I draw form, especially sort of a box, instead of going right to color, I'll be thinking of everything as value and lighting it, sort of a light, mid-tone, and dark range, rather than getting caught up in the complexity of all of the colors that are there. As we move over to the other side, you'll see those decisions I've made. Make that rock tumbler a little bit smaller, make a little bit more room for the forest in the background over the top of it. You see I get rid of that yellow machinery back there, and instead I'm going to draw some trees, or block in some trees for painting later. Same thing with the other side. Make the mountains a little bit larger so it makes more of a backdrop to the forms that are there. Again, it's compositional decisions, not so much copying. What I'm doing is skewing the visual elements more, so to me the eye will flow through the composition better, and it'll move from one object to another, one value to another, even one texture to another, and make the composition a lot more pleasing to the eye. So just to give you a heads up, my technique has a lot to do with watercolor paintings. I have a tendency to use a little watery sort of base there, mix up a large pool of that blue. Again, I'm not copying the photograph. What I'm doing is using my memory of what the Montana blue skies look like and then paint across it. And I'm sorry for the lighting. It's reflecting off of the paint. It'll dry later and you'll see the actual color. But now I'm also going in and getting those small, interesting cloud shapes and not giving a uniform blue all the way across the sky, but sort of manufacturing light to dark, back to dark again, keeping my edges as clean as possible to make sure that, again, that edge control, so you can see the difference between the clouds and the sky. I'll come in and lighten up some other areas later, but just at this point, getting a general kind of flow of the color onto the canvas at first. So I'm going to refer you back to a video that I made a little while ago about the painting equipment that I use. This is a transom palette box, and I've got a little aluminum tray there, enamel tray. And in that video, you can see my palette layout, my colors that I use. And if you see me reach above every now and then, there's a little water container up there that I use to mix my paints with. One of the reasons I love using these trays is you can mix up really big pools of color, and the colors can overlap. So right now I'm painting that sky color, and I'm mixing a raw sienna in with that ultramarine blue and the smalt blue, and in getting the shadow colors back underneath my clouds. Hopefully through the glare you can see that use of wet on wet technique that I'm using in the clouds to sort of, again, change the edges from the top edges being fairly square to letting it run and sort of mix together actually on the painting. Perhaps you'll see that I'm mixing that linseed crimson in with the actual blue color along with the brown that I had, just to make sure they all kind of conform together. So there's a sort of a visual color mixing going on. I block it everything with a 1/2-inch brush, and the background I again try to keep as wet on wet as possible. because I don't really want to have any really hard edges on the inside of those forms in the background. So again, the atmospheric perspective takes over and they do drop into the back. Now I'm on to the grassy areas. And one of the reasons I move into there is I'm blocking out those larger mechanical forms like the tumblers and the cars, and making sure again that I have everything sort of framed. I have 4 or 5 really good greens in my palette, but I try to stay away from using them right out of the tube. Instead, what I do is, you might notice that I use a lot of oranges and yellows and blues mixed together, because what you have here is a combination of, fairly recently grown spring grass, and then you'll see in front of the cars it moves into more of a dead sort of grass. It's starting to gray out a little bit, get the sort of brown stems to it, and then move over to a rougher texture over on the left-hand side. So I use a watercolor technique to just make all those colors bleed into one another across the form, again as sort of a backdrop that I'll go over the top of it with textures later on. If you go back and review my painting technique, you'll see that I mix up a really big pool of that nice yellow green, and then I move complements into it, like some oranges, some blues. I'm using earth colors, so I got a yellow ochre mixed in there. And by those pools, you might be able to notice that what I do is I pick out different value systems and then lighten them up, and I can paint wet into wet, sometimes paint squares opposite, and then push the other colors into them and let them bleed and mix on the palette. That way there's a little bit of surprise and a little bit of variation rather than everything being utterly controlled. I'm mixing the colors for the background now. And one thing you might notice is I don't go to green. I go to the original mixture I have, put in some ultramarine blue, a little bit of orange, some raw sienna, and some yellow. And that way what I'm doing is using the 3 primaries to kind of mix that and dull it down a little bit. You can get those tree shapes in the back. I painted the sky before, so now I can use them to silhouette a little bit more. Same thing with the mountains. And then paint around those objects to make sure I have like clear edges. As I start to paint these trees in the background that I'm using to replace the machinery back there, I'm not quite certain how they'll fit in, so I'm giving sort of a little bit more of a lit yellow green on the top, and then coming in with some dark areas. The idea is to kind of make them fit into the background and silhouette the machinery in the foreground. Not quite certain if that's working out at this point, but I'll fix that and try to work on it later. Right now I'm about to start mixing up the background color in the mountains for that noonday light on the ravines back there. Simplifying it a lot just so you get the idea of it, but at the same time it doesn't overwhelm the composition. I want to acknowledge the mountains in the background, but I don't necessarily want the eyes to go right back there to take a look at that. It's more hinting at the background than it is trying to paint the terrain. What I'm going to do now is show you my color and value decisions and the mixing techniques that I use. For the skies, I use a combination of smalt blue and a little bit of turquoise. Mix those first, see what the color looks like, and then thin it out with white as needed. For the underside of the clouds, I use that raw sienna. And since it's a complement with orange in it, it makes for a really nice colorful gray rather than just using black to dull it out. In the mountains, I use linseed crimson and ultramarine blue to knock it back there a little bit, along with that brown that's there. To paint the grass, I used a large pool of lemon yellow along with linseed crimson and painted in that base color, and then started moving in more of the earth colors like the yellow ochre and maybe some of the oranges to change the color of it as it moves across. Nothing drastic, but you can see the pools of color that I'm pulling from. Perhaps you'll notice that the values are pretty uniform, so the eye doesn't get jarred by the contrast as your eye moves from the right to the left of the composition, or vice versa. I blocked the tumblers in earlier using a combination of raw sienna, ultramarine brown, flame red, and just a touch of burnt umber. No black. I want to make sure that I don't put any dead black colors in it at this moment. We're going to move into a close-up of the palette. You can see those colors being mixed in that broad pool into the little small separate ones. And then the technique used on the tumbler is very wet into wet. I'll come back and firm up the edges later. I'm not finished with my blocking in yet, so again, it's seeing how those broad colors and values all work together. I want to make the painting harmonious, so at this point, again, it's all about that value and shape design, making sure that everything works together like a painted jigsaw puzzle before I start getting in any detail. So I'm using gouache, which is a thicker opaque paint. Like I said before, I do have a tendency to paint more as a watercolor, and traditionally it would be from light to dark. And I'm going into my darks right away because the way I'm going to use it is I'm going to use the painting as an underpainting. So everything I'm putting down will have a texture or have a light reflection coming off the top of it. My first paint mixture I'm putting together raw sienna, ultramarine blue, and alizarin crimson. I want that purple color, but I also want to have a little bit of that kind of red oxidation, a little rust underneath it, to kind of pull it together and give it a little bit more texture. After I created that base pool of sort of a purplish color, what I did is I started to move the more rusty colors in, and then I'm going to pull some whites into that. So I'm still pulling these separate little pools out, and I can dip my brush into it accordingly or mix across them if I need to have a new color. This way I don't have to keep mixing a base color. Instead, I can mix new ones into it and then always go back to the original color to pull that, say, violet out of that if I need that elsewhere on the car. So I'm back to that really wet on wet technique here, and I'm trying to paint sort of the base coat of where the paint of the car gets worn off during those harsh winters in Montana. I know the edges of paint, the values in between the different kinds of paint, the white paint and the purple paint, look rather sharp and hard, but I know that I can't paint them like that or the car is going to sort of fall into separate little pieces and it won't unify. So that's why one of the reasons I'm using this wet on wet technique, so they kind of bleed into one another, just like it looks like naturally. It's important to remember that I'm isolating the car in this part of the video, but my eye is constantly going out and seeing how it fits into the rest of the painting. That goes for any detail that I put in, whether it's these little sparkling parts on the hoods or whether this is the reflection off the rust into the bumpers. I have to make sure that all those little slices of this thing work in the next steps before and after. I'm about to thickly start applying some dry brush techniques into the bumpers for the reflection of the sky off that chrome. But perhaps again, you'll see that I did add a little bit of the local color from the car, a little bit of that red in there, so it's a little bit more harmonious with the rest of the paint that I do. I don't want those bumpers to come peeling off of the front of the car. I want them to work with the rest of the painting. Also, I use this time to keep my eye moving over to the card to the left because I've got to make sure that I plan what I'm doing now into what I'll be doing in the future and then make them again both unified even though they'll be contrasting colors. Right now I'm about to mix up some ultramarine blue, some burnt umber, and some raw sienna with a little bit of flame red just to get that dark parts where the hood comes together in the darker areas. I'm not using any black though. I don't necessarily have anything against black. It's just that I find that a lot of times when it's used, it dulls the color out rather than enhances it. The brush I'm using now is called a dagger brush, and it has a very sort of cleavage edge to it, and it's really good for the idea of picking up like very thin lines like a rigger brush, but also being able to turn it on its side and get a really nice broad sweeps of paint strokes with it. One of the reasons I use gouache is that you can really paint opaquely over the top of it. So what I'm going to be doing is painting the shadow underneath the car, knowing that I'm going to be putting a thicker, more opaque greens over the top of it for the grass and the brush. Once again, I'll be pointing out some paint mixtures like the ultramarine blue, using the reds in there. That's for the rusty color there. It's a little of the flame red with the raw sienna. And then for the darker colors, I'm using ultramarine blue, the raw sienna, and the linsum crimson. And there's the reflections, which is back to the schmaltz blue with a little bit of the white, and then a little bit of the ultramarine blue back in for the reflections on the fenders above. Now I've got that sort of yellow-green set up as my underpainting, and now what I'm going to do is start to put the textures of the grass and the bushes and the leaves on top of it. And I'm using a little bit of that sky color there, that sort of light blue, since it's pointing up towards the sky. I'm going to use that color to kind of, again, unify it and sort of dampen the brightness of the color down so it sits in the background a little bit. Using a little bit of the yellow ochre in it to show that the grass back there is perhaps a little bit more on the drier side. Okay, on to the other car now. So luckily I have this turquoise green here that I usually use for water, and it matches this up pretty good, so I'm going to make use of it. Probably I'll mix other colors into it. You can see that lemon yellow I'm mixing in there to get a little bit of the light reflection of the grass underneath it. I'm going to paint this pretty broad here, just again using a really nice watery solution. So I'm going to mix, you'll see I'll mix in some other paint with it in just a little bit. I'm being very, very careful about keeping control of my edges on that car because I don't want the forms to look too soft. I want them to keep their edge and their shape so to be identifiable, even as I paint the rust, the chrome, and the paint on the car. Again, I don't want it to break into pieces like an out-of-control jigsaw puzzle. When I mix the raw sienna in with it, since it's a complement of green, it's going to make a really nice gray brown for that rusty area. And so to make sure that you can see that, I actually let the paint run and then pick it up as it gets thinner across the palette. I try not to make the colors too splashy, so I use a fairly limited palette when I'm doing this. And as I mix that ultramarine blue into that raw sienna for the dark areas, it's going into that wet on wet solution again, so the colors bleed across the form and don't become too edgy. Then once again, like the last card, I mix up a thick solution with the sky color on it, so then I paint the chrome, top of the chrome, and the reflection using sort of a dry brush technique so the paper shows through a little bit more. Makes a nicer texture. After dry brushing that blue color onto the chrome that points towards the sky, I don't want to go too hardcore with the edges there because then all of those forms will break apart in the slivers. So I'm putting a little bit of earth color into my mixture just to make sure that it holds together with the rest of the landscape there. Now I'm really starting to place those darker colors down. If you notice, I'm not using black in my mixture, I'm using mostly, again, burnt umber and ultramarine blue, a little bit of flame red to block that in. And I may bring in some black later on, but I'm using the blue as like an underpainting that the black will sort of visually mix with. As I paint, make sure that you keep an eye on the photo above and make comparisons about what I change, what I manipulate to make work for the painting, and the color choices that I make. So I move back to the palette now to show you the decisions I made in relationship to the color. You can see that base green turquoise I used for the body of the car, and then started mixing the reds in, which of course is a complementary, so it makes a really nice gray, and then finally coming in and mixing all of that in with the blue for the darker areas. Now I shift over to the flatbed truck, and again use that green as a base color to get the continuity of the background. Mix up the car body with some white with a little bit of blue in it, and then go into the back where the flatbed is and use up that mixture. Notice I'm moving the greens and the reds together for that really nice kind of dull brownish gray in the back. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but on the white body of the truck where the roof faces the sky, I mixed a little bit of blue in with it so the sky dome shows up, and then using that purple as a base color and then painting the rearview mirror over the top of it. So I've done the underpainting now, so I'm going back in and establishing more information and more textures on top of my painting. And so I'm getting the cast shadows coming off of the rock tumblers. And that may look like it's black, but again, it's an ultramarine blue mixed in with a burnt umber. So it's still got a lot of color to it. So I'm starting to make some thicker paint here. And you'll see there'll be sort of a blue cast to the shadows that I'm putting in. Now that paint's really sticking right over the top of that thinner paint, so I'm using it for effects like the bolts, deeper shadows, some of the texture, even the shadow back underneath the turntables there. When it comes to the details, and I prefer kind of the idea of information rather than details, as you'll see I'm putting the bolts in and some of the mechanical parts. I'm still trying to be rather spontaneous with it and keep it sort of fresh, keeping the rhythm of the bolts or whatever those forms may be in the background, but also not overthink them so they look too overthought. And that way what happens is they'll not really work with the spontaneity of the rest of the painting. Not surprisingly, the speed and the direction and the flow of your paint marks are really important. The faster you paint, the thinner, most of the time, the thinner paint you get. You get dry brush effects, which makes a really good kind of, you can see it right there, a little bit more of a scraping against that rusty outer part of the form, and gives hints of the rusty texture that covers the top of those tumblers. And now this last little fade in shows where I put the darkest darks underneath the bolts to show the shadow patterns. And these last little burnishing marks take those red areas, so I'm using a little bit more raw sienna, and just adding a tiny bit more texture to those forms. Box that I talked about painting before, you can see the highlights on the top where I'm putting the dry brush in, even putting a little bit of blue in there to show the age of the wood, and the sky color bouncing off that top plane. Then where it goes away from the light, you can see the dark area, and then the mid-tone on the left-hand side. Moving back to our primary car, what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start layering on thicker paint, going across what I already painted, adding a little bit more dry brush texture to it, a little bit more roughness here and there, and contrasting it with perhaps the softer areas on the hood. You can see I'm going over both sides using the sort of texture of that dry brush to show where the paints kind of mix together visually. As I work it up, make comparisons between the photograph and what I'm painting, and you can see there's a little bit more than a few pieces of artistic license here, where I'm moving, accenting certain things I'd rather accent, leave some areas alone to suggestion. And though I'm trying to get the texture on the car and get it interesting, I'm still making sure that I don't lose the shape of that car. So I'm simplifying a lot, and then I'm even changing tones and values a lot to make it fit the entire composition rather than just painting a car. That is definitely one thing that I like about gouache, because you can go dark over light and light over dark. You can mix on the painting. You can mix in your palette and move that onto the painting. Right now you're seeing I'm sort of picking those in-between middle tones to help sort of turn the forms a little bit more, not make those edges so uh, high contrast. I'm trying to soften them up a little bit, just using color and using different strokes. One of the last steps will be to put the highlights on top of the chrome and make sure that I have those whites that play off against the darker edges of the car to bring up more contrast. You also see as I fade to the next frame where I start putting the darks in, you'll see the highlights come up. And I am definitely reaffirming some of those more sharp edges to the form. So as I'm putting the blacks in, it's not so much black. It's again, it's that ultramarine and burnt umber with a little bit of red mixed into it. Now once again, I'm using black at this moment to hit these deeper shadows on the inside of that in the tires, and make sure that those accents hit there, because later on I'm going to be coming over the top of that with another color, so it'll form sort of a base for me. There are sometimes you should be using black or could use black. It's just that when I do it, is to make sure that there's no other darker solution that could be done. And also I must add that the black is mixed in with ultramarine blue and burnt umber. So there's still color coming through there. It looks dark at this moment because it hasn't really dried. and that black is more of an accent. The dominant colors still are the blue and a little bit of that brown. So these last accents are more the blue sky coming down from above and the chrome accents of the ground and of the grass. So we're about to fade into the green car, and I'm going to be finishing that up and making comparisons again back and forth. Normally, again, I don't finish one car, one object, and move on to another, painting in my pieces. I have a tendency to sort of bounce around the whole composition, but for this video, I'm going to tackle one at a time using the same techniques. Make sure as I go through this process that you reference the photograph in the lower right hand corner and make comparisons about changes and readjustments I make depending on its relationship between everything else around it. Again, similar to the last car, you see that one of my last moves here is to get those blue reflections from the sky and then the white highlights on top of the chrome. So I'm just about done with this car, and I'm about ready to move on to the grassy area in the front. And remember, you can see that underpainting that I did. I wasn't too concerned with details and textures, and now what I'm doing is using these different values of grass. And as I paint them, you can see that they start out light and then they darken up as they dry. As I paint, I'm not so much painting every individual blade of grass. What I'm doing is looking more for a rhythm of the movement of it. You may also see that using yellows and oranges and some reds, some complementary colors, even some turquoise blue in there, and then using that underpainting, that yellow-green, as sort of a stage to put the other strokes on top of it so the texture shows up more. I'm painting fairly thick at this point, so that paint's pretty wet. And you can notice as I paint this darker color and show more of a shaded area, and over the top of that, you'll see the paint sometimes mixes, sometimes it pulls the other paint up. And so you get a much more interesting mix. I'm using browns and greens mixed in with my sort of first lighter greens that I put together, again, to bring everything into gear. Also note that a long time ago, I painted the edge of that car pretty solid with a pretty hard edge to it. And now what I'm doing is I'm pulling those blades of grass and those bushes up over the top of it to make the grass look like it's growing a lot more freer. Then you can see there pulling warms over the top of cools and cools over the tops of warms, using that underpainting I did a lot earlier in the painting as a backdrop that I can pull this more dramatic stuff over the top of and put that grass in the foreground and let the car drift into the background. And now this paint dried, I'm going to pull the camera back so you can see it in relationship to everything else in this section of the painting. And hopefully it all works together. You can see the textures and the different strokes. So as I put those strokes down, I have a tendency to go thin lines, then thick, wider strokes, and then, but keep them going in somewhat the same direction so they flow in a rhythmic pattern. Also, you can see how I'm using that warmer yellow-green in the front to bring you more towards the front where the warmer colors go. And I put the cool ones over the top of it. Notice how I put the shadow coming underneath the bumper, and now I'm painting the grass over the top of it, but still letting it show through. The browner strokes there, of course, is supposed to mean a browner grass is starting to dry out a little bit as I move on to the bushes to the left. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in the higher contrast in between that wheel well and the tire and those bushes to the side. So there's almost individual leaves being painted here, but not enough that it obscures the tire. So I'm hinting at a lot of things right there. And then as I move farther into it, you'll see that then I dry brush it. So it has more of a kind of a scraggly look to it. Even does a little color mixing with the shadow back underneath the car. Now using the dagger brush, you'll notice that as I move forward towards this, what happens is that I use these big, broad, thick strokes of paint because I really don't want a lot of detail underneath there. I want it to show more of a plain or bigger mass. Then as I move towards that wooden beam there, then I start to bring out the thin part of the dagger brush and start to lay those blades of grass over the top of it so it creates a little bit more space. And again, notice they're going in the same direction, but they're not lined up parallel to one another. Looks like now I loaded some ultramarine blue in with that color, and then immediately right after it, go in with some lemon yellow, some of that yellow in top of it, and then counterbalance it and put that right on the top so it pops into the foreground and goes in front of that beam, which it looks like the blue wasn't covering. So as we fade into in a sense, the last steps of this, I'm going in with just almost pure white and hitting the highlights. It looks like the glint off the chrome a lot of the metal pieces, using sometimes a little mixture of maybe a little bit of that raw sienna moved in with it, just give it a little bit more warmth here and there. So one last little piece of equipment I'll show you are watercolor and regular colored pencils. Now these are really good for urban sketching where there's a lot of telephone lines and more sharper edges you have to put on stuff. You'll see me use it here for like door frames and for headlights and things like this. The nice hard part about the watercolor pencils is that right after you put them down, what you do is obviously run a little water over it and it'll soften them up. I have a tendency to use them more for textural stuff. You see the roughness of the paper come through on it, and it makes for really nice accents sometimes. Now before I started the video, I put some artist tape around the edges to get a crisp edge on this. And though it's sped up a little bit, I usually don't pull it off at this quick. I pull off it backwards at a 45-degree angle. If it looks like it's tearing the paper, sometimes I'll wait and get it home and then hit it with a hair dryer, and that'll soften the glue up a little bit. but I am definitely, because of the length of the video, pulling a little bit faster than I should be. This is where a little patience is good, because you don't want to make a really nice painting, get it home, pull that tape off of it, and have it rip the paper to shreds. Not a good look. Now the painting's complete and cleaned up. I'm going to bring the original photograph up so you can make a comparison to it. And you can see the artistic license that I've made with several portions of the painting and little changes I've made for my preference. I'm not promoting a style in here. It's more of my process and how I put things together to perhaps make it easier for you to apply your style, using this as a springboard to put your stamp on the painting. So right now we're going to slowly move through the painting so you can see the individual sections and compare them against the entire painting when we pull out at the end. And now we're about to pull back from the entire painting so you can see the composition as a whole. So I hope you got a lot of new techniques and methods out of this video, and it helps you along a lot. I'm going to show a couple of my paintings here at the end so you can look through them. This is from China, from vast bamboo forests to industrial areas to temples. The next images are going to be from the Yanks Air Museum in Chino, California. They have a boneyard where they tear planes apart and put them back together. These last images are from a stormy bay and mountains on the Ring of Barra in Ireland. So once again, I hope you enjoyed the videos. Share them if you'd like to with other people. Leave a nice comment if you like them. And please subscribe, and thank you very much. Again, there'll be more videos in the future.